When all was said and done, though, Latin American nations were on kind of a shaky foundation. There wasn't always a war that destroyed infrastructure um, and the resources of all of these countries. Sometimes independence came a lot more quietly. So that was only a problem in some places coming into the being of an independent nation. But many of these independence leaders had to take out huge foreign loans from Britain and France, for example, and that meant that there was a lot of political instability coming out of independence. People called caudillos, these were kind of like military strongmen or warlords, they've often been referred to, took charge of various nations. So these are some examples of typical Latin American caudillos that ruled in the 1820s, 1830s, and in the case of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna here in the 1840s and 50s, you can see his leg this was his wooden leg. He ceremoniously buried his actual leg that he lost in a battle against the French in 1838 in a show of his patriotism and his dedication to the nation. I bring that example up because that was something that caudillos did. They were very hyper-masculine. They were part of the culture of machismo. They would hobnob with the kind of everyday folk. They would give patronage, sometimes, especially in places like Argentina, in the form of giving beef cattle and ranches to their supporters in return for political support. What this meant was that every few years, another caudillo would challenge the guy who was currently in power. There would be a war. There was no clear line of succession. And so there was this kind of messy replacement of presidents in different Latin American countries during the early independence era. Also, by the 1850s, there was a kind of conflict between conservatives and liberals. And I brought this chart into the discussion because the term conservative and liberals meant something very different in 19th century Latin America than they do in our current political context in the United States. So as you can see here, liberals tended to be, we might think of them as conservatives today. They would like things like free markets. They liked the idea of Republican rule, of constitutions, of having kind of government out of things a lot. They wanted some social reforms, but most preferred federalism. And what we mean by federalism is sharing power between a national government and state and local governments that also gives the state and local governments quite a bit of autonomy. They also adhered to the Enlightenment, which was the kind of mode of thought that inspired the American Constitution and many of the early constitutions of Latin American nations, but they were challenged by the conservatives. Usually the conservatives were those folks like the criollos that I mentioned a minute ago, but also church leaders. So the leaders of Mexico's independence were an exception to the rule in that they were both priests. Usually the Catholic Church was part of the conservative movement. They wanted to see the power of the church over not just religion, but also over politics and economics, which it had. That was something the liberals challenged because they wanted to see more of that go to the state. They thought the nation should have more land than the church, for example, and be better able to lend money to people and things like this. The military was also one of these conservative bastions of power. They wanted to keep these things called fueros, which were special legal rights that were granted to clergymen and military men. After a series of wars between conservatives and liberals, and in Mexico, there was also a French intervention. The French came and took over in the 1860s for a brief time. The liberals kind of won out. The conservatives tainted themselves by being a little too allied with European powers that the Americas had just broken with. And so people like Benito Juarez, who we see pictured here, were liberals who rose to power in the mid to late 19th century. And even though, as we kind of just laid out, they were attacking the old status quo, they still looked to Europe as sort of an example of what their nations should become. And so the next phase that we kind of shifted to right here, I called it liberal ascendancy and neo-colonialism, or the idea that we need order and progress, modernization at all costs. Liberals were big fans of this. What this meant was that they were willing to make major concessions in terms of land, tax breaks, to first mostly British companies, and then later, closer to the turn of the 20th century, to US companies, in order to allow for the construction of things like railroads, telegraph wires, bringing in new equipment and industrialization. These were things that many Latin American nations lacked in terms of having the intellectual capital, the know-how, and the actual money, the capital, to do these things. And so again, in order to modernize their nations and be more like Europe and the United States in that regard, they gave control of large swaths of their economies to multinational, what we would call today multinational corporations. So the pictures here. Here are a few examples that I wanted to talk about. Besides just the technology, places like Peru specifically, and Chile also to an extent, were able to sell guano and make a killing. However, they often allowed European companies to be the ones to extract the guano, and guano is seagull excrement, bird excrement in coastal areas, but it was really rich in nitrates and it was used as a fertilizer, and so it's something that people wanted around the world. It was marketed and it brought a lot of money into Peru and Chile. But again, British companies principally kind of led the charge in evading taxes, getting tax breaks, I guess I should say, to develop the production of guano. And so far less of the actual proceeds went to enrich the people of Peru than went to enrich the coffers of those British corporations. In Central America, by the late 19th century, companies like United Fruit were gaining a lot of territory for banana and coffee production in the region. And following a similar pattern, they were able to get huge concessions from the governments of these places because the governments felt like they needed the technology that the American and British corporations could bring in order to harvest these crops at a large scale. We'll return to that in a minute. But modernization brought a lot of changes to everyday folk, especially in rural areas that they didn't like. Sometimes they didn't understand. It was a strange thing to go from having births recorded in the church, in the parish, to having the state control those things and issue you a birth certificate, for example. Those seem mundane to us. Even the issuance of money and having the state control that was something that a lot of people were afraid of, weren't sure how to react to. And then there were several millenarian movements that developed in the late 19th century, meaning these were movements that looked toward either the second coming of Christ, or in the case of the movement in Canudos, right here in Brazil, in the Bahia, toward the possible return of Sebastian, who was a former Portuguese king. So again, these are things that were built on kind of myths, but they were very powerful ideas that were led by charismatic figures like this guy. His name was Antonio Consigliero, or Antonio the Counselor. He was kind of a wandering cleric through the countryside that amassed a large following of people to his brand of folk Catholicism. And he created this new community that was about 30 or 40,000 people in population by the early 1890s. And they said, we're not going to listen to the rule of the state. Brazil itself had just become a republic only a few years earlier. It shifted from being an independent monarchy, which was something unique to Brazil. And so, again, people were like, we're not going to recognize the power of the republic. And the officials down in Rio de Janeiro sent army after army against the people of Canudos. They held them off for a while, but ended up massacring most of them, including Consigliero, by 1897. Something similar happened in northwest Chihuahua at a place called Tomochic. And by way of comparison, and this one was just pointed out to me in one of the classes I'm teaching right now, or it was someone thought of this, I hadn't necessarily thought of it on my own, was Wounded Knee in the United States in 1890. Similar, sending the power of the government against this people who, from their perspective, they're trying to deal with the negative impacts of modernization on their lives because most of them didn't get rich from this. Most of them were forced into wage labor and didn't make enough money to subsist. And that was kind of the base problem. And so they turned to these other movements that the states of Brazil, Mexico, the United States used military force to put down and ended up massacring huge sectors of their own populations. Briefly, I just want to mention 3 important wars of the 19th century that redrew maps in Latin America. The first one, of course, was the US-Mexico War. So these 2 images here represent the US-Mexico War. This started over a boundary dispute in Texas. Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas, always saw it as a province in rebellion, and so when the United States annexed it, and then claimed that everything along the Rio Grande up to its headwaters, which would have included Albuquerque and Santa Fe as Texas. And again, that was a claim that Nuevo Mexicanos were very upset to hear that they challenged. But because of this dispute over what constituted Texas and whether or not it could be annexed, a war began. The war raged for a couple of years. The Mexican military and the Mexican people, because of political infighting in central Mexico that I kind of already mentioned, but also because they had been waging wars against people like the Comanches and the Apaches up here in the north for years prior to 1846, they were in no place to fend off the United States. Even though on paper, in some ways, it looked like the Mexican army was actually more professionalized by 1846 than the US Army. But when all was said and done, from the perspective of Mexico, this war was remembered as the War of the North American Invasion, when North Americans came into Mexico and invaded and took almost half of the national territory. In the United States, we kind of don't remember it that much at all. It's just like boundary was redrawn. This used to be Mexico, as if there was no conquest involved with that. But, again, this is something that had created the modern day US-Mexico border. And of course, this shows the 1848 border along the Gila River. The Gadsden Purchase happened in 1853 that drew the line like this that makes up, didn't mean to do that, that makes up southern Arizona. So that changed just a little bit then. But again, this was one of those major turning points in North American and Latin American history that meant New Mexico was no longer part of Latin America. In the Paraguayan War, or the War of the Triple Alliance, Paraguay ended up losing a lot of territory to Brazil, Argentina. This was a war that dictator Carlos Solano Lopez kind of got involved in, thinking that Paraguay is in such a great position because an earlier dictator named Dr. Gaspar Francia, he put Paraguay on its kind of own path. It was isolated from other places, and it built its own economy and seemed to be much stronger and much more stable than many of the other post-independence nations. However, Solano Lopez let himself get into this kind of quixotic battle to prevent Brazil from going into Uruguay. When it was all said and done, so many Paraguayan men were enlisted and put into military service that by some estimates, 90% of the male population died in this war that took place between 1864 and 1870. So it was a major loss for Paraguay. It was one of the first wars that we have photographs from. This was the era of the US Civil War as well, which was another of those first wars with photography. But, again, you can see the ways that the map was redrawn. The last war to mention, and there are many others, or several others we could also talk about, but these were some of the key wars, was the War of the Pacific that took place between 1879 and 1883. This was a war fought between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. From this map, you can see before the war, Bolivia had a connection to the Pacific Ocean. This was part of Bolivia. And this area here is the Atacama Desert. I mean, it's a very dry and unforgiving terrain, but it was a place that was rich in nitrates. It was a place that these British companies I mentioned before had their eyes on. And these three nations got into a war over it, and in the end, Chile won out. Bolivia became landlocked, lost its port, lost its access to those nitrates, and Peru also lost territory. So this is these black lines show the present day boundaries. Chile gained all of that desert area.